quickly through the first section with me. I prefer if you can avoid asking questions when I review. At the very start, I sort of laid down an understanding of Israel. I laid down an understanding of Israel through 12 events, and I'm going to do that again, go through this again, and then I'm going to talk about the differences in the presentations, with one exception, between Janan and Moshe. Most of you here attended those too. Okay. So here's the short history of Palestine. First, we have Zionism that starts in the 1890s. Then we have the British Mandate in Palestine, starting in 1914 after World War I. And then the Holocaust, which helps drive the move to create a state of Israel. And then the United Nations is created in 1945, and its proposal is to create a two-state nation. That's the first two-state nation proposal we have. And then the state of Israel is founded on May 14th, 1948. And this is a big day of celebration for Israelis each year, but it's not for many of the refugees who refer to it as Nakba. And the catastrophe is what that means in Arabic. The group that was formed in '64 to represent all Palestinians was the PLO. And the 1967 war, Moshe almost called it a miracle, which I think he would say she referred to it as the low point in the history of Israel. So two different things, and you can see it was green before the war, and light green and dark green after the war. That's all the land they got. And since then, it's been a fight over how much of this green land Israel is going to turn back over. They still have the Golan Heights, and the West Bank and Gaza are contested areas, and the Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt in 1979. The acts of disobedience, the guerrilla warfare that went on between 87 and 91 is the first intifada. There's a second one in the year 2000. The interim peace agreements were called the Oslo Accords in the 90s. After that happened, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by a guy with some problems, but a guy named Benjamin Netanyahu led the opposition to the Oslo Accords. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner the song sheet that he had in his upper pocket, singing for the peace in Israel. The bullet went right through it. And then the group that took control of Gaza is Hamas, and they're elected and they take over. They take over in 2005, and they're elected. The last time there was an election there in 2006. And then which capital did Donald Trump recognize as the capital of Israel? And that's Jerusalem. So
oh my Lord.
So that's our background, and that's our base. And the reason I wanted to do that was in the next two conversations, we have people who emphasize certain one of these events and ignore other events. And I want you to notice some of the differences in the presentations. First, Janan had a very elaborate PowerPoint presentation that I thought was very effective. Moshe and I have done a number of things together, so we decided to sit down and have a conversation. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both of those. Janan referred repeatedly to Palestine, whereas Moshe referred to Israel and said that the term Palestine was a slur that was created by the Romans for that area. I don't know if that's true or not. I've heard that it's repeated frequently by Jewish people. Moshe also lives in America and in Israel, and he left the day after our presentation to head back to Tel Aviv. She lives only here, and because she lives in the West Bank, is unable to go back there. And then finally, just an illustration of the points I'm going to get to right now. She made, during her presentation, no reference to Hamas the whole time during the conversation, and made one reference to the Holocaust, which she said that the state of Israel was created after an influx of Jews as a result of Holocaust, etc. He then mentions it a great deal, talking about family members who've been involved, whereas he didn't mention Nakba. And he only discussed Nakba, the refugees, when I asked him to. And on Hamas, I talked to her afterwards, and you'll see, I'll tell you her position on what Hamas is. So here's two sides to the war. The first one was the importance of history. I started with the Zionism. Najib decided to start between the year 2000 BC and the year 700, saying that her heirs had been there since the Bronze Age. He took his back to the year 1800 BC to say that they had been, that his ancestors had been there since Abraham. They had two very different views of what the Bible was. He saw it as a work of literal history and sacred story. She kept on referring to it as a guidebook and said that the God of the Old Testament was a tribal God and that it's not literal history. In terms of the Zionist movement, she was asking, why did the Jewish people have to move to Palestine? Why was that area, that particular time? There were lots of other areas that they went to. His point was no one else would take people. He made reference to the St. Louis, the ship that went around and tried to land in the United States and other places, and 900 some Jewish people on board, and 200 end up being executed in the Holocaust. The importance of the Holocaust, as I just said, most sees it as the key to understanding the formation of Israel, and Janan saw it as Jewish people were driven to Palestine by, as I said, the Holocaust, etc. It just wasn't, I mean, that's not an important part to her discussion. What's important to her was the Nakba, as I said. To her, she says the formation of the state of Israel led to 700,000 refugees in Palestine. When I asked Moshe about that, he said, what refugees? They should have gone to another Arab majority state instead of staying there. The Oslo Accords, he sees the importance of the Accords and says it's very important that we have a two-state solution there. This next answer from Janan, she made reference to, and then I asked her about later, and she explained, and that is, she's not a fan of the Oslo Accords at all. She thinks there should be a one-state solution, that it should be a democracy with majority rule, which would be beneficial to the Arabs, since there's more than 2 times as many people there. And then on Hamas, as I said, he sees it as a terrorist organization. She made no mention of it during her presentation. Afterwards, she told me it's a resistance group and a former charity. It was primarily created to bring money in to help people in Gaza. And then their views of Donald Trump and Netanyahu. Janan says she wasn't a fan, and surprisingly, Moshe isn't a fan. So we found a point of agreement between the two of them. Yay, we should have stopped right there. Except for Moshe then mentioned he supported the move of the capital to Jerusalem. So that's one favorable thing, but I don't think either of them is going to vote. In fact, Janan's organization encouraged people to, what's the thing on the ballot this time? The uncommitted. They encourage people to vote that way. Moshe's group, I don't think, encouraged people to vote either way. And then about the current conflict, October 7th in his Israeli response, Moshe said on several occasions that October 7th was our 9/11 and wanted us to see it that way. Najib says Israel is engaged in genocide, a term she used 5 times during the presentation. When I mentioned that to Moshe, he said, it's not genocide, this is war. So he sees this as what's going on right now is this typical war. And the result of the conflict, Najib said, Israeli Defense Forces have killed 30,000 plus people, mainly women and children. And Moshe said he doesn't trust Hamas's numbers. He doesn't believe it's 30,000. And then he also pointed out that the U.S. killed 450,000 to get to Osama bin Laden. So basically, we're not anywhere near that. And people in America didn't call that a genocide, or many people did not. So those are the summary of the points they made. Was there anything else anybody could think of there was a contrast in what they had to say? Okay. Then I made it 15 minutes. We are now ready for our two main people to lead the conversation, Pastor Kevin and Conor. I think Conor's going to go first.
Yeah.
So we've got
We're going to sit here and
yeah.
we're just going to continue the conversation. Yeah. So.
We give you the high seat.
No.
I don't like that. And in the center.
This is
you can't just do like low, medium, high or something.
These two are same side.
Okay.
So I'm going to share a few thoughts and reflections from both the sharing and also our perspective as Christians about this issue. There's Pope Paul VI on January 1st, 1972, which is a day of peace, has this beautiful expression, if you want peace, work for justice. And I think that's important for our discussion here. And then Micah 6:8 is an important scripture for me. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. And part of me thinks the reason why we are having this series is to have a better understanding of what's going on, but also importantly, what's required of us as Christians. What does the Lord require of us? And some reflections from what Moshe and Janan shared. Janan shared this afterwards with me. I don't think it was with the group, that many Christians feel guilty in criticizing Israel because of the Holocaust. And that struck me, that convicted me. She also shared that Jews from around the world have a right to move to Israel, but Palestinians who were displaced during the 1948 war do not. I thought it was interesting that Moshe got quite agitated when he was recounting the Islamic version of the binding of Isaac. For those of us who know our Bible, God calls Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain to sacrifice his only son. And when that happens, Abraham is faithful to God, and as he's binding Isaac and getting ready to offer him as a sacrifice to God, God intervenes, and there's a goat or a ram in the thorns that God says, I want you to use this lamb or this goat as the offering, not your son. In the Moshe shared, and I didn't know this, that Muslims believe that it was Ishmael that Abraham was instructed to bring up to the mountain, and that Ishmael was the one that was, and Moshe was quite agitated about, which I think is understandable, that this more recent religion has come and rewritten some very important stories for who we are and what we believe. But it just struck me. Moshe raised the question, I think with some legitimacy, as to why there are still Palestinian refugees in so many countries. And I was convicted by that as to, he talked about his family coming here in the early part of the 20th century, and they've been assimilated. Why is it that there are still so many Palestinian refugees that are still refugees in so many countries? In Jordan alone, there's 2.5 million Palestinian refugees living in 10 refugee camps. Jinan described the Jewish settlement of Israel starting in the late 1800s as a form of European colonization. I had never heard that narrative before, but it struck me as, it just struck me, I suppose that's how I'd say it. So look, those were some reflections that I wanted to share.
Thank you, Conor. And thank you, Dan. You both brought in some really compelling and notable voices on this issue. So thank you for your care and for your time and letting us as St. Matthew's wrestle with this difficult issue. And thank you, St. Matthew's, for being here. And engaging on a difficult topic. I haven't been able to be physically present with you for the first two gatherings, as you might imagine. Being like the new guy here, there's lots of stuff I'm getting pulled into regularly. Like, actually, speaking of new guys, I actually wasn't here for the first few minutes because I was in the new member class for a few minutes, so I wasn't just running late, I swear.
Not that they're more important than us.
No. Well, you're getting more time from me than they did. And I have to acknowledge, as I watched both of these videos back, the recordings of these two presentations, I found myself at moments having pretty strong visceral reactions, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who felt that way. And I ask for your continued gracious listening and care for when we speak. And as you can see, I've got a lot of what I'm saying here pre-written just because I think this is a delicate concern, and I want to be precise and intentional with my words today. So, thank you, every one of you. I have a couple things I want to share. I have some things from both about our denomination, but I want to share some of my own experience and some of what I'm bringing to this. When all that's unfolded over the last few months, like how things have hit me. I'm going to go back about 10 years. This is back to 2013, so 11 years ago. I was in the Holy Land then, and my experience there profoundly shaped my perspective on matters of Israel and Palestine. And I have to admit, this is a matter that I care deeply about, and I'm really excited to be a part of a church that engages in difficult and important topics like this. I'm using the word difficult intentionally. One thing that doesn't sit right with me with matters of Israel and Palestine is often I hear people say it's complicated. And I feel like it's complicated is often a way to shut down the conversation rather than to keep it going. And beyond that, yes, there are a lot of factors, there's a lot going on. I'm not sure if it's complicated as much as it's difficult. And I don't think those are the same thing inherently. And anyways, back to my time in the Holy Land. I didn't plan this out, but I happened to be in the Holy Land at the same time that, at the time, President Obama made his first visit to the Holy Land. And I actually was in Bethlehem the day that President Obama came to Bethlehem. So I waited in a crowd at Nativity Square. That's the main gathering space in Bethlehem. It's right by the Church of the Nativity, as you can probably guess from its name. That's the church that commemorates, according to tradition, where Jesus was born. And so I am just lingering, just Kevin and a number of Palestinians, just lingering, waiting to see President Obama arrive. This would have been, I think, probably my first chance at the time to see or probably still would have been my first chance to see President Obama with my own eyes, not through a TV or anything. But this day, President Obama's visit was significantly delayed by a sandstorm. There was a big sandstorm, so he couldn't fly from Jerusalem to Bethlehem by helicopter. I mean, it's like by car, it's probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes, so it would have been a short helicopter ride, but nevertheless, wasn't safe. So he drove in a motorcade. And so after about 2 hours of waiting because of the significant delays, I saw the presidential motorcade arrive. They drove right up to the Church of the Nativity, drove what it was the Beast or whatever that car is that he drives in, right up to the door, opened the door, whisked him in, and he spent a few minutes inside. They whisked him out, and he drove away. I didn't see him. I don't think anybody did, and I think that was the point. Honestly, I don't know if I've ever felt so embarrassed to be an American as right then. I was hanging out with a crowd of curious Palestinians for hours, and my president couldn't even just make a wave. Was it because the crowds were deemed unsafe? They were just a crowd of curious people trying to see what was going to happen. Was it because the U.S. sees Israel, not Palestine, as an ally? Whatever it was, this moment symbolized something for me, an all too common phenomenon over the years with Israel and Palestine, that the average Palestinian person is just overlooked and unseen. I think this feels true today. And so one of the takeaways for me from Janan, as I listened to her, I was struck, particularly at the beginning, by how she painted a human picture of Palestinians. And this has been all too often lost over the years. And as I was thinking about this, this is going to kind of go far afield for a second, but I remembered a speech actually from a Jewish character in The Merchant of Venice, the Shakespearean play. Act 3, Scene 1, Shylock says the following: I am a Jew, hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you and the rest, we will resemble you in that. I bring this up because, like with Shylock, far too many Jews over the years have felt wronged, unseen, and uncared for by Christians. As Lutherans, we have a troubled history here. The legacy of this feeling, and this feeling itself, is still present for Jews today. That was visceral. I could feel that viscerally in Moshe's presentation. I heard it in his story. And also, I heard it in Janan's story. And I saw it that day in Palestine too. So we're talking about two people groups here that both have felt unseen and uncared for by Christians. So that makes this a little bit of a fraught issue. And it's also challenging that both sides tell a story where they are fundamentally the victims too. So that's I think one of the challenges is that both sides tend to talk past each other on that point. And with this side of being unseen and seeing each other as victims, I want to comment on two things that Moshe brought up. One was about what happened Gaza post-2005 when Hamas took power and the Israeli settlers were removed. Moshe talks about how there were agricultural businesses left by the settlers in Gaza that netted in excess of $10 million annually. And the first thing, and I quote him directly, is they did or immediately was destroy them all. So Israel left, and then the Gazans just got rid of all of what was left behind. I'd heard, honestly, since I care about this issue, much of these kind of similar accounts to what both sides had brought up, but I hadn't heard this before. So I used my friend Google. I Googled something like Gaza 2005 farms, something like that, destroyed. And I found an article from Haaretz, which is the longest running Israeli newspaper in print. So this is like a legitimate news source here. This is not just like somebody like spouting stuff off on social media. And the author of it is a guy named Peter, I think it's pronounced Beinart, is one of the more well-known like voices on the issue. I'm just going to read this quote directly from this article, so bear with me. American Jewish leaders usually tell the story this way. When the settlers left, Israel handed over their greenhouses to the Palestinians, hoping they would use them to create jobs. Instead, Palestinians tore them down in an anti-Jewish rage. That's what Moshe told. Beinart continues, but one person who does not endorse this narrative is the prime mover behind the greenhouse deal. He doesn't say it here, but later in the article he mentions that the money that was left behind, this guy actually bought a lot of the farms. So he paid for the farms from the Jewish business people. Is an Australian Jewish businessman named James Wolfenson, who served as a special envoy for Gaza's disengagement in 2005. In his memoir, Wolfenson notes that some damage was done to the greenhouses as the result of post-disengagement looting, but they came through essentially intact and were subsequently guarded by Palestinian Authority police. What really doomed the Greenhouse Initiative, Wolfenson argues, were Israeli restrictions on Gazan exports. In early 2005, Wolfenson writes, the much-awaited first harvest of quality cash crops, strawberries, cherry tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet peppers, and flowers began. These crops were intended for export via Israel for Europe, but their success relied upon the Carney crossing between Gaza and Israel, which beginning in mid-January 2006 was closed more often than not. The Palestinian Economic Development Corporation, which was managing the greenhouses, taken over from the settlers so that it was experiencing losses in excess of 120,000 US dollars per day. It was excruciating. The lost harvest was the most recognizable sign of Gaza's declining fortunes and the biggest personal disappointment during my mandate, writes Wolfenson. So, from the second point I want to bring up is that Moshe said that Gaza could have been like Singapore, which was transformed from a desolate, unwanted island to a rich city-state. Mind you, Singapore's economy is buoyed by having one of the busiest ports in the world and being a hub for global trade. But in contrast, since Hamas took power in Gaza, Gaza has been under blockade by Israel. There's nothing going in and out except for just a small amount of aid. Gaza can't be a hub for trade like Singapore if it's under Israeli blockade. It's just not possible. My point here, for both of these points that I bring up, is that I'm resistant to a pro-Israeli perspective that essentially blames Palestinian suffering on the actions of Palestinians. Like, why didn't they become like Singapore? Why didn't they keep on trading and using these farms that were left behind for them? And does not take seriously the actions and the policies of the Israeli government and the Israeli military along the way as well. Okay, actually, here's my second point that I thought you really helpfully lifted up, Dan, is that, I'm going to go off script for this part just based on what you said, that Moshe said that October 7th is like Israel's 9/11, and said after that, the US killed 450,000 searching for trying to get bin Laden. I looked, it's actually a lot higher than that. It's awful.
Closer to a million.
Yeah, and then not to mention all of the famines and just the secondary deaths are millions and millions of people. So yes, the US ultimately killed bin Laden. And yes, the US also ultimately deposed Saddam Hussein. But I don't know how many people would say that what the US did in the ongoing global war on terror was a success. Did it help? Did it achieve what we wanted? I'm not convinced by that. And so I worry that one of the US's close diplomatic allies in the Middle East and in the world hasn't learned the US's lesson from our own mistakes. And as a country, we're continuing to aid and abet an ally falling into similar mistakes that we made. And so with that, that's not just my perspective. I would argue that that is essentially the perspective of our bishops. The ELCA Conference of Bishops have recently issued a statement on the Israel-Hamas war, and they wrote an open letter to President Biden about a month ago. I'm going to read a quote from it. Mr. President, we ask you to support a permanent bilateral ceasefire that will bring a lasting end to the violence. Only then can the root causes of violence and suffering be addressed. We also call upon all parties to work toward a lasting, just peace that protects all human life and ensures the long-term security and sustainability of all those living in the Middle East. The letter continues, we are also concerned about the consequences that the Gaza conflict has had in the United States, perhaps most vividly in the sharp rise in expressions of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, anti-Jewish, and anti-Muslim hate. Aware of your efforts to address these trends, we pledge to do all we can to speak out and to work together with your administration and Congress and with our ecumenical and interreligious partners to try and prevent all forms of hate that demean the dignity of every person. And then also the ELCA bishops have signed an open letter with the Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a global and ecumenical group that has made similar claims. Short quote from that. We say, enough killing, and together demand a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. So kind of to zoom out, the two things I wanted to respond to is I think that both sides have, in this conflict, have seen themselves throughout history, and recently too, as victims. And I struggle particularly with the, frankly, victim blaming towards Palestinians. I struggle with that. And I also want to lift up, and I say I endorse and support the perspective that that I'd say the kind of church leaders in like across mainline Protestantism, Catholicism, are saying is like, this is not going a direction that's good. We need to take a step back, stop killing each other, and work for peace, and as you said, Conor, work for justice as well. And I think that is something that I think has emerged really since this series began as what the kind of church bodies in our country have been pointing towards, and I think that's a good thing. That's my 2 cents, at least.
Did you see the first? We had 3 sessions.
Yeah.
The one on Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. I did watch
okay.
that one. You did a great job on that one. Thank you.
No, I wasn't looking for that. Since it's my birthday, you can say whatever you want. So we're having this session today because a number of you said you felt like people were talking at you and you wanted to respond to all that you were hearing.
Yeah.
So does anyone want to start us off and have some thoughts?
Do I have to use?
You do. We're recording the thing.
It helps for the recording.
Okay,
yeah.
my perspective is, I lived in Egypt for 2 years in the late 70s, early 80s. And at one point we did go to Israel. We had to get there through Jordan. And my Bethlehem story is that, and if you have other questions, I can talk to you. But my Bethlehem story is we stayed in the Arab side of Jerusalem. We took a city bus from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. While we were on the city bus, some Israeli soldiers stopped the bus, came onto the bus, took a woman, probably Palestinian, she wasn't an Israeli woman, off the bus, looked at her cards and arrested her and took her away. And then our bus went on to Bethlehem. So that was my experience with Israeli soldiers. I don't know what happened there, but just a little perspective. And that's the late 70s.
By the way, I was in Jordan on that day that that Barack Obama was there. I was leading a group of people here, and some of you might have been there on that day, because I took a group in 2011, 12, 13, and 14. So we didn't see each other, though.
No. I was in Jordan.
I was in Jordan like the week after Holy Week.
You were following us.
I was, or maybe you were following me.
Anybody else have some thoughts?
I have a thought.
Okay. On this.
I like your description of how the issues are difficult rather than just complicated, because I think that does. One of the things that I think as Americans we tend to project onto other countries is we assume that our way is the best way. And one of the things we had an assumption that democracy for everyone, that's a one size fits all, we're going to push that out. And I think we also fall into the trap of thinking that a separation of church and state, a secular state that accommodates multiple and diverse religions should be applicable to everyone. And I fall into that. For me, the struggle is I don't understand what both sides really want. They'll talk about, I want a two-state solution or a one-state solution, but beyond that, do they really want to occupy the same state? Do they really want to accommodate each other and not have this level of conflict? I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what both sides really want, and also the viability of possibly having a state similar to ours, which has a separation of church and state, and is a more secular society that accommodates a diverse religious background.
Who wants to go first? You want to answer, Conor?
Yeah.
I would say, so growing up in Ireland, there was a low-level civil war going on in Northern Ireland as I was growing up, and there was an almost endless amount of information in the newspaper and on the news every day, and it was confusing to me as a child growing up as to why two Christian groups, Catholics and Protestants, were killing each other. And I came to I appreciated one of the points that you made, Pastor Kevin, is we get ourselves, our human nature, we get ourselves into difficulty if we see only our own suffering and are not aware of the suffering of our enemies. And in Northern Ireland, I'm very grateful that people have largely stopped killing each other in Northern Ireland. And they've done that because they've worked for a fairer society or a fairer community, justice. And sometimes justice is this nebulous term that's up in the Netherlands. But what do we want as human beings? We want shelter. We want to be able to have a safe place to raise our children. We want to be able to put food on the table. These are basic ones that we all have. We want to be heard. If we've suffered, we want it to be acknowledged that we have suffered. Those are basic ones that we have as human beings. We want to be treated with dignity. Actualizing those things, you start to create a community that is more in the model of the kingdom of God. And that is the beloved community, where there isn't one group that's identified as the other. One thing that's interesting in the United States is both Muslims and Jews are both sometimes identified as the other. As Christians, we honor Christ when we encounter our Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters in our daily life by treating them with dignity.
Yeah, I was just gonna say something quickly. I think it's hard on a lot of these things because everybody talks past each other. I asked Janan, what do you think of the two-state solution? She said it's propaganda. And I asked Moshe, what do you think of the one-state solution? He said it's unsustainable for Jews. So while the two of them were talking about solutions, they're not solutions that either side found acceptable.
So I just said that often things are difficult and not complicated. I'm going to take that back a little bit right here. I think that one of the things that is complicated is I think on this issue, we see a lot of people not acting in good faith. And so it requires some parsing of statements, or sometimes people with different perspectives use similar rhetoric. That is complicated here. And I'd say that there are kind of also two one-state solutions that exist. Because in effect, there is a one-state solution, that there is one legitimate, like one internationally recognized country in Israel, and then there are occupied territories under military occupation that are not a state per se. And the challenge that's happened too is since the 67 lines, more and more settlers have carved up the West Bank. So I can remember hearing somebody say that they were trying to that there had been efforts to do a marathon in the West Bank, but there weren't 26.2 miles of road without a military checkpoint for settlements to do a marathon.
That would slow you down.
Yeah, it'll slow you down. Well, especially if you have to stop and bring out all your IDs and things. So I really feel like it's really been in the last few months that I've heard like Janan's positions espoused more broadly, that saying realistically a two-state solution isn't possible, largely because the West Bank has been carved up so much by settlements that it's impossible to remove all the settlements, and it's impossible to do that many land swaps. And the challenge you run into is that Israel wants to be both the Jewish state and a secular state at the same time, but nevertheless a Jewish state. And as you mentioned, Dan, that if there became a one state for both Palestinians and Jews, it wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. And so that's a third rail issue for many people. Then you run into the challenge, like there's, for instance, a term that has been kind of condemned in the House recently of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Some people are saying Palestinians want to live with dignity, want to not live under military oppression, want to be, free and have the same sort of human dignity and rights as someone in Israel would. But there's others that are saying basically that means we want to drive the Jews out. And the problem is you don't know when somebody says that at first. So one of the ways that's complicated is that there are not good faith actors on both sides. And I brought up, I think, for instance, it has to be named that Israel's government doesn't want a two-state solution and doesn't want a one-state solution. What they want is, actually they do want a one-state solution of basically it being all in Israeli hands. And that has shifted over years as Netanyahu's tried to stay in power. He's brought in people that view that way, have that perspective more and more into his government coalition.
I just want to share this very briefly. There's the three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's only about 15 million Jews on the face of the earth, and half of them live in Israel. There's, I think, over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and going up. And then there's well past 1 billion Christians, 2 billion Christians. And it's fascinating to me that the Jewish community is so small. And then the second thing I wanted to say, it's a litmus test for the health of a community or a country as to how they treat their minorities. And Jewish people outside of Israel are always a minority. And they're always a prevalent minority because they're proud of their culture, and it's distinctive. And how a community or a country treats their Jewish brethren is a litmus test as to how healthy or unhealthy that community or nation is. And so I wanted to share that.
Did that answer your question?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think there's one answer.
Yeah.
And I really put that out there more to
Yeah.
stimulate dialogue. But we want to take those difficult, I'm sorry I'm not being recorded, but we want simple answers, and they're not there.
Yes, and so for those that didn't hear, we want simple answers, and they're often not there. Thank you.
Dan, how religious is Moshe?
What's that?
How religious is Moshe?
He's highly religious. He's
Not or,
no, he's not Orthodox. He's not conservative. He's Reformed.
okay.
He's done 4 presentations here. He did a class with me on Judaism, the different branches of Judaism, and then we did one on anti-Semitism within the Lutheran Church before we went to Germany, which affected a lot of people here in a great way, and especially when we went to some of the places in Germany where you see various things there. And I told you, every time he comes, he mentions the fact that the first question he was asked when he came here was by someone who said, do you not think that some of you are responsible for what happened in the Holocaust because you had all the jobs and I wouldn't let the Germans do their work. But his response was great. A little less intense than he was last time. He just asked, where did you hear that? And the answer was the German immersion school that I attended. So, does anybody else, you have a question?
Yeah, the practical thing is, if you're a Jew, correct me if I'm wrong, and you choose to live in Israel, you have a place. And how much in-migration is there every year? And we talk about the settlements, the land grab, et cetera, where are they gonna put them all? It's a tiny country. Is that part of the difficulty, is when they invite other people of Jewish faith, they need a place for them to live.
I think you only have full citizenship if you're Orthodox, so just to be aware. But I mean, there is an influx of some, but again, as Conor stated, there are only 15 million Jewish people in the world. So if everybody moved in, it would create a crisis. But it's not. I mean, we're talking about an area the size of New Jersey, so it's a. That isn't, I mean, there are lots of problems, but that's not one of the main problems. The problem is you have 2 groups who can't talk to each other and see things very differently. and have a long history. And as I said, it was interesting that when we started talking about who belongs there, one started in the year 2000 BC and the other one started in the year 1800 BC. And both of them said, my group's been there longer.
Yeah, and this is, one thing. There is an influx of immigration to Israel because their anti-Semitism is rising in the world. And so that's a problem. I would say that there hasn't been too much concern that I've heard publicly about, like, is there enough room for all, everybody that would be welcome to return to Israel or go to Israel and become a citizen to live there. I haven't heard that as a justification for the settlements, the settlement movement. I would add, and this is I have a lot of opinions and perspectives on things that I didn't bring up here, so I'm going to go far afield for just one sec, and I'll come back quickly. Also, one challenge you run into is that I observed about at least 10 years ago, and I would venture to guess it's the same way today, is that in the last maybe few decades, there have been a significant influx of Jewish immigrants from Russia, where there was a lot of anti-Semitism, and they have struggled to assimilate with the Jews that have been in Israel for a longer time, often Ashkenazi Jews. And so that has caused friction internally. There's also a small but historic Jewish community in Ethiopia, and Israel has been reluctant to let many in on the grounds that they're economic migrants and not seeking to return home for their Jewishness. And so I bring that up to say that there is a lot of internal dissension and conflict between Jewish groups, not to mention the secular Haredi, like the ultra-Orthodox tension, which has been bubbling up lately too. So there are, I think it's important to not recognize the Jewish community as like they're small, and yet they're not homogenous either. And that there is, my suspicion, at least, is that having a common enemy can help galvanize an otherwise divided group of people.
Anybody else have a question? How many of you have been to Israel and the West Bank or any of those places? Okay, a good number of you. I mean, if you've been, Tel Aviv's a rocking place. The last time I was there, Metallica was playing on the beach, and it reminded me of Nice in France.
Yeah.
But things are very different too. My daughter studied at Hebrew University for 6 months, and it affected her, one of my daughters, it affected her in a great, great way. And she's involved in a number of Palestinian protests as a result of how she was treated when she was there. So it's each area is very different in many ways. I mean, if you start off in Jerusalem and go to Galilee, it's completely different. I mean, it's dark, I mean, it's sandy and brown and everything around in the southern part, and then it's green and lush when you get close to the Sea of Galilee and so forth. So
I think Jerusalem and Tel Aviv are what, since it's a pretty windy road because there's an elevation gain, but it's still 45 minutes apart from each other?
Yeah.
But they feel like a world apart. One feels like Miami almost, and then the other one feels, there's nothing in the United States quite like Jerusalem. That there's an ancientness, and I don't mean conservatism in the sense that like how it's used in the United States, but like a traditional, like conservative, like historic religiosity that I just didn't feel in Tel Aviv. The ethos is profoundly different, only 45 minutes away from each other. So I have a couple of questions just to ask people that maybe what we can do. I was thinking, we have 5 minutes. You know what? I'm not going to ask those questions because I was going to break you up into groups, but I think since we only have 5 minutes, it might be easier just to stay as a large group.
I was just going to say, it's funny, when I lead the groups, and on Tuesday I have a group going to Greece with me, but it's funny when we take that road, we arrive in Tel Aviv and drive to Jerusalem, and I'm trying to get everybody to be aware of all the issues. And before 1948, there were a number of fights between the Palestinians and at that time it wasn't a state, but trying to shut down things between those two because it was the only supply chain. And in fact, Don mentioned one of one of the terrorist incidents. But when I take groups, everybody's like, what's that flower over there? What kind of tree is that? And I'm trying to tell them that there's important religious stuff going on here. And besides that, I have no idea what kind of tree that is. So do you have a question that you think would be good for us to discuss just for the last couple minutes?
Yeah, while perspectives I think are pretty deep-seated or at least strongly felt, I'm curious that as we've heard a Christian perspective, both the Palestinian Lutheran perspective and also particularly some of the like Christian Zionist perspective, particularly more in like evangelicalism, like premillennial evangelicalism the first week. Then we heard a Palestinian perspective, then we heard a Jewish perspective. So we've heard a multiplicity of vantage points, knowing that any one of these vantage points we name doesn't speak for a whole religion or ethnic group. But I'm curious, are there things that you've heard over these past few weeks that have caused you to reconsider anything, or something that you heard or seen something differently that you hadn't seen before? Because I really appreciated how you brought that up earlier, Conor. And Carl?
Probably feeling of confusion and what's to do given all of the information. But I like the path that Conor laid out today, and you, Pastor Kevin, with saying what did the ELCA say, a ceasefire, let justice be pursued, and then sort of how I would act, what, given that small formula, how to act. But I guess that's at least a starting place for me, knowing that this conflict has gone on for 4,000 years, and it's going to take a long time, and we're sending $19 billion of new missiles to them, so that's not healthy either.
Yeah.
My perspective, and maybe this is shared by others, is I've gotten much more cynical. I look at the two groups, and they're basically Bedouin blood feud, want to kill each other, and I don't see a solution. We can speak as Christians and try to propose justice, but I don't see a willingness between the two parties to get there. And I read a book recently on the Accords, written by Jimmy Carter, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. It's a really good perspective on the negotiations that went on, his personal relationships with some of the players involved. Netanyahu wasn't one of them at the time, but Begin and Sadat were. And I just come away with this, shrugging my shoulders and saying, is there a path to peace other than all-out war and annihilation? I don't know.
So one of the things we didn't touch on in the classes is one of the reasons that Hamas acted when they acted. And one of the reasons why is because the United States government has been very involved with both Israel and Saudi Arabia for Saudi Arabia to sign a peace deal with and recognize Israel. The Iranians did not want that to happen, so they encouraged their proxy, Hamas, to start a war that has caused a lot of trouble. And but why do I say that? I say that because there is I wouldn't be cynical. As Christians, we're not called to be cynical. I appreciated Pastor Marilyn when she spoke here, when she gave the sermon a month or so ago. God is constantly surprising us. And God is not cynical. We were talking earlier about justice. I was having a look. There's 2.5 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Jordan is a very stable country. And one of the reasons why is because the Jordanians granted citizenship to the vast majority of those refugees. And they share the same rights as Jordanians. There's 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. They do not have citizenship. They don't have the right to own property. That's a festering problem. That's a problem that just continues. The people continue to suffer. There are people doing good things to build peace. Those are the people that we should go towards and support, not the troublemakers. So.
I was just wanting to know if there's anybody else. I mean, it is true, it's difficult, but history is full of what incidents and situations where people thought were intractable, but were able to correct over time. You mentioned Ireland. When I was growing up, that was thought there was no way. It was Protestants against Catholics. But eventually, a younger generation comes along and isn't happy with the situation and is able to change it. It was interesting to hear both of them say, and I told you it's the only point where they both agreed, is we need to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu. You mentioned that as well. I mean, Moshe said it's in his interest to continue the war because he's going to be voted out or impeached as soon as the war ends. So, I mean, what happens then? It's unclear who takes power.
It's actually going to jail when the war ends because he has tried to change the Supreme Court and the judiciary because he has corruption charges that will put him in jail the moment he is out of power. And so he has some other interests at play here. But from my view, this is the worst place Netanyahu has been in his time since he's been reelected prime minister. So there is shifting tides. I think there's a lot of cynicism in the leaders on both sides, both Hamas's leaders and also with Israel's leaders. But I think there is a lot of hope from the people on both sides that I observed at least 10 years ago.
Janine told us that she only listens to two media outlets, Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera. That was the one thing I reacted to. The thing is, it's important for you to hear from all sides and to know what others are saying, and that complicates the situation, but it also, as we started off today, each side is going to de-emphasize certain events and emphasize certain events, and you should just be aware of that, so you're aware of the entire issue, and not, her brother, I saw him give a speech, and he said he only follows Instagram for his news. And that's sort of scary, but that's where he thinks he's getting unfiltered responses to what's going on in Gaza. So, do you want to close?
Yeah,
I want to comment on that real quickly. I have to admit, when Janan said things like that, I'm pretty hesitant to push back on broad sweeping things about distrust the mainstream media, and that I have a kind of a little bit of an itch that forms when I hear those kind of things. And yet, it was interesting to me that this past week, The Intercept released an internal memo from the New York Times that said that that this conflict should not refer to occupied territory, genocide, refer to the people in Gaza as Palestinians, but as Gazans. There were a number of specific directives there, and if you go back and look, the way the New York Times has framed it, there's definitely not it's not a totally neutral perspective. And so I bring that up because there is an imperative to hear a variety of voices on this. And I think social media is interesting too, that a lot of organizing has happened over social media. I think it just needs to be named that there's a generational difference. You'll see the people that are, just generally people that are older and remember young Israel or the formation of Israel have a much more sympathetic view. And let's be serious, TikTok has deeply influenced a generation beneath me to have a strong view of sympathy towards Palestine. So there is a generational difference, and also the media that we consume is informing how we see this conflict unfolding.
Could I say just one last thing?
I think it speaks to who we are. I think it honors God that we invited a Palestinian woman and a Jewish man to come and tell us their own story. So, and I'm grateful to be part of this community because of that.
Yes, completely agree. There's a lot more to be said. So I appreciate you engaging and listening and asking questions. I'm happy to continue this conversation. But first, let us pray. Good and gracious God, God of Abraham and all of Abraham's children, you are also a God of peace. We ask that cooler heads prevail, that peace reigns, that justice reigns in our heart, in your world, and in particular in the Holy Land. May resentment and distrust be eclipsed by love and mercy and forgiveness, and so that a new chapter may begin in the Holy Land for all who hold that land as sacred and special to them. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
As a professional